this video, I'm going to talk about Bernard of Clairvaux. We are starting with him because he has to be the most famous and influential mystic of the Middle Ages. Just about every other person I'm going to talk about was influenced by him in some way. That is why he is getting his own video. There's just a whole lot to cover about him. Okay, so Bernard was a Cistercian monk, and I want to start with that. The Cistercians used the rule of Benedict, but they are one of the reforming orders that popped up in the High Middle Ages. The first Cistercian monastic house was established at Citeaux, France, which at that time was called the New Monastery. And that was established in 1070, sometime in the 1070s. Within a couple of decades, 4 different daughter houses had been founded, including one at Clairvaux in the year 1115. The new movement became known as Cistercian because the name for Citeaux was Cistercium in Latin. Okay, so it derives from the Latin name of their kind of mother house. All right. Bernard is actually not the only Cistercian you'll be reading this semester. Thomas Merton was also a Cistercian, specifically a Trappist, and the Trappists were actually a reform order of the Cistercians, which were a reform order of the Benedictines. All right, it's kind of interesting. All right, Bernard can be a little bit difficult for some modern readers. There is kind of a sense of paradox to his life. He was a monk and he wrote about contemplation, but he was also like really involved in church politics, church leadership. He was probably the most famous cleric of his era. So let's do just kind of a brief overview of his life. He was born in the year 1090, the third of 7 children in Burgundy, France. His mother, Aleph, was from the high nobility. His father, Tescelin, was a knight, which is actually of interest because Bernard did not seem to have kind of any aversion to military activity. And later in life, we see him actively intertwining monasticism and kind of military activities, specifically in the Knights Templar. In fact, interestingly, he was not the only mystic to have a knight for a father. Eckhart was as well, and I think Suso did as well. All right, so like many other saints, kind of the story of Bernard's early life has elements of the miraculous. Kind of legend says, well, his mother was pregnant with him. She had a vision of a white dog in her womb, and she interpreted this as the child was going to be a great guardian of God's house and an outstanding preacher. Did this happen? Who knows? We do know, though, that his mother was a very strong force in his life. And his biographies write about her piety, and she died when he was a teenager. After her death, Bernard found a very, very strong connection with the Virgin Mary. There is a rather interesting legend around that as well. Kind of legend sources say he was praying before a statue of Mary when she pressed on one of her breasts and sent breast milk into his mouth. This signified the wisdom he received from the Virgin and also showed that he had found a spiritual mother. Whether this event actually happened is somewhat irrelevant in a sense. The interesting element to me is how the story gives a miraculous underpinning to his devotion of the Virgin Mary. And you can see some paintings of this if you Google it online. Okay, anyway, if I were to pick one word to describe Bernard, it would have to be charismatic. A contemporary called him both physically and spiritually irresistible. Another firsthand account commented that he was almost something superhuman, that his face had a divine majesty and that grace poured from his lips. It was also said that mothers hid their sons and wives hid their husbands when he was near, lest he tempt them to run off to be a monk. Okay, so a really good example of kind of how influential his personality was, how influential just of a person he was, is the way that he joined the monastic life. Bernard had learned of the monastery at Citeaux in the year 1100, so he was only like 10. But before he wanted, and he didn't join right away, but before he joined the order, he wanted to try it out. So Bernard ran a practice monastery of sorts on his family's property, where he convinced a good portion of his male family members, including an already married brother, to join him. Okay, so when Bernard finally arrives at the new monastery at Citeaux, he brought with him about 30 companions. All right, you also see this charisma play out again in his ability to promote the Second Crusade. You see it in his success in church politics. You see it in his skill as a preacher. All right. Bernard was very successful at a very young age. He became the abbot at Clairvaux when he was only 24 years old. And this appointment was, of course, somewhat controversial because of his age. And because of this, he really struggled with his own authority, extreme self-doubt. Especially he had monks who were much older than him. He had monks who were family members that he was now in a position of authority over. He also suffered a lot from kind of physical ailments. He was sick a lot, and sources say that he was quite frail, so it was physically taxing on him as well. Regardless, Bernard was a talented and capable individual, and this inevitably meant that he was going to be sought after to assist the church in a very public way. Okay. In 1128, he was involved in the Council of Troyes, where the first rules of the Order of Knights Templar was established, and he was involved in that. His involvement in that brought him further notice in both monastic and political circles. However, it was kind of his dealing in the Papal Schism of 1130 that Bernard truly emerged as kind of a diplomat, as a very strong force within the church. Okay. Through the 1130s, Bernard continued to exert influence in the church. He backed a lot of Cistercian candidates for different episcopal positions, though he actually always refused a higher position. Like he refused the position of archbishop himself. All right, so let's talk a little bit about his controversies, because I think we have to do that with Bernard. So the big criticisms of Bernard are, number one, the differences between his contemplative ideals and his active lifestyle. Number two, the crusade, Second Crusade. He supported it. It was a disaster, militarily, morally. Hildegard of Bingen also promoted the crusade as well, though. I mean, it kind of is what it is in this time and place. Three, his treatment of Peter Abelard, which is something we talk about in History 1. But if you ever want to just read a good book on, so you can see it, on Bernard of Clairvaux, it's a newer biography by Brian Patrick McGuire. It's called Bernard of Clairvaux, An Inner Life. I really like it. It's a good one. But he talks about how during the French Revolution, Bernard's bones were just like cast away. As you know, there's this whole program of kind of trying to get rid of religion and things in France at the time. But Abelard and his young lover Heloise's bones were kept. Why? Well, because Abelard by that point had become this very romantic, this very tragic figure that kind of moderns could get behind, right? And in some ways, his theology is much more modern than Bernard's. So this has been kind of a point of criticism. Bernard, he was not a speculative theologian. He was very traditional for the time. He liked his theology to be, right. And if it wasn't, he was going to write against you. He was going to act against you. Okay. So how should we assess Bernard's shortcomings? I have a tendency to like kind of imperfect saints. Not all people feel that way. These are genuine criticisms of his life, of things that happened within his life. And so I just put it up there. All right. What about his mysticism? Let's spend a minute on that. As a 11th, 12th century Cistercian, he was committed to the contemplative goal of experiential union with God. His writings are also overwhelmingly concerned with love. While there's this idea of courtly love, and this was a very strong influence in the High Middle Ages, Bernard is concerned with divine love. He uses bridal imagery frequently. His commentary on the Song of Songs is of particular note, especially in that regard. You, of course, are reading On Loving God, which Bernard wrote in the 1130s. So he was in his 40s. So you're getting a more mature Bernard here. But ultimately, that is also a text about love as well. And up on the screen, I just have, you're going to read it. But this is how he starts the book. It's kind of funny, actually. You wish me to tell you why and how God should be loved. My answer is that God himself is the reason why he is to be loved. As for how he is to be loved, there is no limit to that love. If this is this a sufficient answer? Perhaps, but only for a wise man. And then he spends the rest of the book explaining it for the rest of us. All right. So Bernard continued to have an active life until his death in August of 1153. It was reported that even after his death, he kept busy granting miracles to the faithful where he was buried. So that's just kind of, I guess it's not that quick of an overview, but that's a overview of Bernard's life. I hope that gives you a little bit of context, a little bit of understanding about him as a person as you read on Loving God. All right, thanks everybody.